Hello and welcome again, everybody, to another author coaching session panel. We are the lovely hosts, SD, Kyra, and Zara. Because things are mirrored on here, we have issues directionally. I apologize. You guys are in for a real treat tonight. Talking about, I think all of our, to different degrees, favorite topic when it comes to writing, which is world building. I'm going to be talking about how to do it well in fantasy and how to not suck when you're doing your world building. And then Zara is going to be talking about world building for literary fiction. And Kyra is going to be taking both of them, smashing them together for the perfect blend of magic and realism, because that is what she does best. So very, very excited for this, guys. First off, just real quick to make sure that you guys know, if you haven't already, go down. Sorry, wrong way. Over on that side is the subscribe button and the little bell notification icon. If you could please take one moment of your time to go down and hit that little button and the bell, we would greatly appreciate it, because that lets you know when we are going live. And we have lots of live streams to go. So you do not want to miss that. Again, down there, subscribe. Also, if you would just love to see more of our lovely faces, down in the show notes directly below us, this I do know for a fact directionally, is direct links to our Instagram profiles. So if you want to see more shenanigans, see more of all of us in our writing journey, I highly recommend that you go give us a follow. So that is all there is to say about that. Now we're going to dive into the juicy, meaty bits of our conversation tonight, which is world building in a fantasy fiction world. I love world building. Now, I grew up reading Tolkien, okay? And that is where my love of world building really began, was Tolkien. And actually, quick side note, the chat is open. So if you guys have questions about world building, please make sure that you drop them over in the chat, because we will take those questions. We want to help you guys with world building too, not just talk at you. We want to talk with you because we love you. Okay, back to Tolkien, because I love him more. Love Tolkien stuff. Particularly when I got into reading the Silmarillion, which is like next level Tolkien nerd. That is really where the meat of the entire world takes place. And the lore in it is just absolutely beautiful. Gorgeous writing. And I wanted to have that same level of world building within my fantasy worlds. And it's the same level of world building I ideally would like to see in more fantasy worlds. What I tend to see, however, is a bunch of cobbled together things that are like, hey, but look at the shiny things. And I'm like, ooh. And then they do something that breaks the shiny things, and then I get angry. And then it ruins my entire reading experience. And I don't like that. And so I would like to help more authors avoid ticking off their readers. So the way that I tend to look at doing world building, and this is regardless of whether it's fantasy or science fiction, you can honestly use this in both, is what I call the 4 C's, which is creatures, cultures, creation, conflict. If you can boil down those 4 C's, you are going to have a really fleshed out world. And the thing is, nobody else has to know about it. Just you. You are the only one who has to make sure that you don't screw it up. That's it. Bottom line. So we'll be going over how to do that. The other key element to really solid world building is what I call the B.A.S.T principle. It sounds super intelligent, I know. But basically what it is that world building is 2% big ass shiny things and 98% making sure you don't screw it up, and i.e. being consistent with your world building. If you establish something in chapter 1 and then break it in chapter 6, that's a problem. If you are not doing it on purpose and if you better have a really good explanation of why you broke it. And it has to be the book is out and 5 months later because someone has rage tweeted you. Be like, why does this happen? You're like, oh, I totally meant to do that because it's like this thing. That no. Mm-mm. No pass for you. Straight to deal. So we're going to dive into world building. The 4 C's of world building, to be exact. So we're going to start with creatures. Now, when it comes to fantasy and science fiction, one of the things that I love to see are creatures. It doesn't have to be anything huge. It doesn't have to be anything spectacular. It could just be something different. And just that is enough. But you have to take into account the creatures. Why? For instance, in my book, and I use my book a lot, and I realize that, but I have 6-foot centipedes. I have 6-foot slugs. I have blood-sucking banshees. I have she-fairy ghosts. I have giant mountainous troll-like creatures that are incredibly stupid, but they can beat you to a pulp. There's also sirens, which those will be coming in book 2, which huzzah. All of these are not just filler. They have to have a direct impact on the cultures around them. You can't just say there's 6-foot centipedes and then everybody just goes about their day hunky-dory like there aren't 6-foot centipedes. If there are dragons in your book, your cultures better recognize that there are dragons, whether they are good dragons, whether they are bad dragons, whether they're kind of like, we don't kill them, they don't kill us dragons. Like, you can have that, but culture is going to be defined by its proximity to these creatures. For instance, if you are out walking in the Pacific Northwest, and which is where I live, and Bigfoot culture is huge out here. Why? I don't know, but it's a thing. We have a whole Bigfoot festival at one point at my town. I think that was probably the one and only Bigfoot festival I will probably ever attend and see ever again. People love their Bigfoot. If Bigfoot existed and we had proof, you might think twice about walking out in the woods by your lonesome. I'm just saying. If Loch Ness was a thing, you're going to be double checking the shorelines and the ripples in the water before you go swimming in a lake, because who knows whether there's a Nessie lurking below or not. Okay. Megalodon. Does he exist? Does he not? Who knows? Makes you question whether you're going to want to swim out in the ocean, though. That's the thing. If you have interesting creatures in your world, they should have an impact in some way. Now, those are kind of like big, scary creatures. You could have cute, cuddly, fluffy creatures if you wanted to. They still have to have an impact. Are they domesticated? Are they wild? Are they used for labor? Are they just pet companions? What does that look like? These are the types of world building things that you have to at least ask yourself. You could say, I don't have any. Perfect. And you move right along. That's all you have to do. But you have to at least ask the question. Second one is cultures. Obviously, there are no monoliths. We are a diverse species as humanity. So unless you are tailoring your story down to a single kingdom, in which case there still should be some form of diversity, how that looks will vary greatly, mind you. But if you're talking like epic scale, guess what? There are going to be people who don't look like you. There are going to be cultures that don't act like how you do. So you should be thinking through, what do those cultures have? What do they offer? What do they represent? What do they do? What are their traditions? What are their foods? What religions are they? What magical abilities do they have, if any? Do they differ? What languages? What linguistic differences in how they say things? Again, these are big brain thoughts that don't necessarily have to have an answer in the book. You just have to make sure that you know them so that way you represent it correctly. So in my world, there are 4 main kingdoms on the continent of Wintenaith. And the one lower to the south, Exfos, that is more kind of inspired by the Tuscan countryside. You know, I have their imports, I have their exports, not written down, mind you, just a quick. They sell really good wine. People love it. That's their export. They're also the homeland of the shifters. Ungear is based more on kind of this like Scottish kind of feel. Canarmore is more, I guess, kind of French. They're just kind of pompous and arrogant. So, I mean, no offense to French people, but y'all. Thaidu is primarily based on like Mongolian culture. They're horse masters. Like if you want a horse, you go to Thaidu to get it. And then there's the realm of the Aragid, which is an entirely different thing. It's the fall of the old empire basically brought everything down, and no one really goes up there. No one knows what's going on up there except me. There's also other continents with other kingdoms and other things that are going on. These are the types of cultures that you need to at least take into consideration, especially if you're like, hey, this is sci-fi. Guess what? Now you're not adding just human species. You're adding like different species, different races altogether. You have to build that to some degree, at minimum, a foundation. So that way you have something to build off of and to offer people. The next one is creation. So I see authors, they get on the struggle bus with this, and then they just go on the roundabout of struggle all day. When it comes to creation, the geography of your landscape should have some sort of impact on travel time, on where they're going from point A to point B. The amount of research that I had to do to find out how much water a horse can carry in the desert before dying of thirst. I had to research that. I was helping an author with that. I also had to research how far can a horse ride in a single day if pushed. Well, fun fact, depending on the breed of horse, about 100 miles. Those are long distance race horses. Your average horse is about 30. So if you're like, oh yeah, they traveled 50 miles on horseback that day, your horse is dead. If it's not a particular breed of horse, and if you were not resting it or swapping it out for a new horse. Big brain stuff. So you have to take that into consideration. Climate. Is it temperate? Is it tropical? Is it desert? What are the seasons like there? Believe it or not, positions of mountains make an incredible difference on whether you have a barren wasteland or a lush Greenland. Now, in some cases, especially with fantasy, unless you're just like a huge geography nerd, the vast majority of readers don't care about if a mountain range blocking the tropical winds from the south moving north, thus creating this like barrier to rain. Most readers are not going to go there. However, it is important that you are consistent in your world building. If it's further north, then you will see shorter trees, shorter grass, shorter bushes, thicker. They're going to be potentially more densely packed than farther south. There's going to be less moss because it gets less rain in a desert, or like a high desert setting. Okay, like you have to take these types of things into account because the flora, the fauna, and the animals that live there, all of that plays a part into your world building in your story. And if you fudge with that too much, it breaks the reader's suspension of disbelief. Because if you have a polar bear in the tropics, looking at you, Lost, there's going to be questions. And if you don't have a payoff for that, looking at you, Lost, it raises people's ire level. Just saying. So don't do that. Don't be like Lost. Lastly is conflict. This is a super important aspect to world building, not just plot. So the way that you can look at conflict is think of like 3 concentric circles. The biggest outer circle is global. What is the global conflict that is going on and happening within your world? I have everything in book 1 situated on a single continent. Book 2 introduces the second continent, and it has its own geopolitical issues. Further east, there's even more shenanigans happening on a global scale. You don't know that. I have to know that. Why? Because by the time that my story in terms of the timeline gets to that point, history has happened. And I have to understand what that history is because I have to be able to accurately describe it to people when asked. So the next level is national. Now, on a national conflict, this could be if you're simply like in a zoomed in picture, like, yep, single kingdom, there's still going to be political machinations going on. So there's still going to be internal national struggles outside of any global conflict. So what are those national ones? And usually they're both happening simultaneously. They each play off of each other. So you have to take that into consideration. The last one is personal conflict, because the personal conflict can happen in regards to the national conflict and in response to a global conflict. Or it could just be, hey, everything's hunky-dory in the world, but that person is still struggling with what? You have to figure that out and what that part is. So that's kind of breaking down the 4 C's. Now, when it comes to creating rules in a fantasy or sci-fi world, you have to understand that you are making an unspoken promise to your readers that this is what your story will be like. And if you break that promise by breaking one of the rules, bad author. Don't do that. Not as in you're a horrible author, but just that it's bad authorship is essentially what I'm trying to say. So when you are establishing these things, these 4 C's, right? Looking at the B.A.S.T principle, looking at that 98% is where you're making your promise. You have to be consistent. As you move from kingdom to kingdom, depending on what your book looks like, or from star system to star system, things change. You have to call attention to these things. You have to stay consistent with these things. If one kingdom dresses differently than another, then you should see not a stark difference, but a transition. If you look at the way people dress from the West Coast with their skinny jeans and whatever else that they have going on, which is just, it's not pretty, and you move to the East Coast where like New York, you're looking at like, 3-piece suits and whatever. It's a different mentality. It's a different form, but there's everything in between, right? So it's not, again, it's not a monolith. People in between or on the borders are going to speak both languages and or a mixture of them in their own unique dialect. Okay. This is the type of stuff that you should be thinking about on a high level. It doesn't mean that you have to go full Tolkien and create an entirely new language for every single person, but it means that you have to be consistent with it. Consistency is the king when it comes to world building. So as you build your rules for the characters, for the creatures, for creation, for the conflict, how people interact, what the kingdoms are doing, all of these things, you establish the rules. If you can do that, then you don't have to dive in to all of like the nitty-gritty details and then over explain, because you're trying to over explain it to yourself when you're info dumping. So if you already know it, you don't have to info dump. I have gotten lots and lots of comments from reviewers and from readers about the world building in my book, which is ironic because honestly, I don't provide that much world building. Like, I immerse you in the world, you feel it, but I don't spend a lot of time explaining it all. And we move through several different kingdoms, but I don't spend time to be like, and then this was the export of this, and then they were super good about that, and then they spoke this dialect. I don't do that. I just make you feel like you're in it, and I make it feel big because I'm consistent with it. You guys can do the exact same thing as long as you are consistent. So, hopefully that is of a big help to you guys. See a comment from Kyra. So how do you prevent world building from functioning like a D&D campaign? Is that too formulaic? I think world building to an extent, like D&D has its place, just like with character creation. I think really if you boil it down to just the 4 C's, then you're going to get out of the formula because you're looking at it through the perspective of what's the world outside around me look like? Does that what this looks like? Take inspiration from cultures. It's not cultural appropriation. Believe it or not. I was accused of that. And they're like, this is cultural appropriation of the Irish people. I'm like, I am Irish. Get thee behind me. So it's not cultural appropriation. Now, if you are basing, let's say, historical fiction on a particular culture and you do not do your research, bad author. Do your research. Talk to people from that culture if you have the opportunity to, and do not use, I don't know any Japanese people. Not an excuse. I'm sorry. So put on your try hard pants, try harder. Find people. You can actually do this. It's okay. You can use different languages. I use Irish in my book. And it took me a long time of cross-referencing to make sure I was actually not insulting somebody's aunt by accidentally using an Irish insult. Once I found that out, that's when I was accused of cultural appropriation. It's like, I am Irish, so joke's on you. I love Irish culture. I love Celtic culture. If you love a culture, then you should, by default, be doing research to represent it well, particularly if you are trying to portray accurately, historically, that culture. If you're just using it as inspiration for fantasy, you can mess with that a little bit. There's no clear lines of like, oh, well, they're clearly Irish and they're clearly Welsh and that's clearly that or clearly this. There's a mix in there. So just know that you can, if you're using the 4 C's and if you're thinking about like, okay, this is inspired by this culture, but what do I need to change to make it fit in my world based on the geography of the world, based on the economics of my world? That is going to distinguish it enough and you're going to be just fine. So going from there, I want to pass the torch to Zara because this is so far out of my lane. Like for literally anything when it comes to literary. So Zara, take it away. Tell us how to do world building in literary fiction.
Well, thank you for passing the torch. First of all, that was awesome. I learned so much about fantasy and high fantasy, especially since that one is completely out of my lane. So I guess we can trade information while educating. So this is a dear and important topic to me since where I see authors often go wrong is either not establishing the world building because they assume it's there since it's literally fiction and thus automatically it has to be there, or they establish it poorly and they don't stick to the rules they established. I think that you already mentioned it, and that kind of goes across the board when you do world building. um, Writing literary fiction or any fiction that doesn't include fantastical or magical elements doesn't mean you're getting a license not to do world building. um, it's more than just where the story takes place. Like SD said, it's literally the mechanics of how the world in your story works. And I think that ultimately it comes down to planning your rules and sticking with them. The scene level world building gives readers information of your story's world by showing your characters in that world. The keyword here is information. It may appear in your head loud and clear, but your readers need to know the rules you've set up. Otherwise, they're going to assume. So, if your character lives in Gramercy Park in New York, then they are going to assume that this person is rich because that's what Gramercy Park is famous for. But if you decide to bend the rules or change them completely, and you want your main character and this person that you're writing about to be in a bad financial standing, then you need to give that information to the readers in your world. Gramercy Park is where the less financially fortunate live. You need to establish that. Remember that you still write fiction, right? So it's not nonfiction, facts, facts, facts. You can bend the rules and create the world. That's the beauty of it. Um, Ultimately, in literary fiction, instead of the four C's, I would boil it down to TD, themes and details. Um, since you're writing to a certain degree about the real world, there's too much of everything to describe. So you need to condense by identifying your themes. I'll give an example from Sunset in La Paz, my upcoming book, since that's what I'm immersed in right now. So the protagonist, Alejandro, he's a composer. His mind is musical, therefore he sees the entire world through musical lenses. Music is a theme, therefore I describe every interaction he has or every place he goes depending on how his senses perceive it. If he's in the theater, orchestral sounds soothe him, but if he's in an airport or a market square, to him it's noise disturbing his peace. So I have to describe the airport based on specific noises people make that upset him. That's where the detail element of the world building comes in. It needs to be animated. Your reader needs to stand where your characters stand because you are standing there with them, but your readers are not. So, with that being said, um, your story may not need all of the physical details of the outer world though. If your characters are confined to a specific area, then they don't need to know how the world works on a technical level outside of it. For example, Alejandro will be confined or more or less to La Paz, the capital city. So I'm not going to bother with describing how the entire climate of Bolivia works outside of La Paz if my characters aren't affected by it. So when it comes to metaphysical elements, that's something completely different, because that's metaphysical. Explore it if the metaphysical elements are unusual, and make sure that people have a good understanding of the metaphysical world in your story. Bolivians are highly superstitious people, and the portion of the nation that isn't Catholic, which are the indigenous tribes and populations, they pray to the goddess of earth. So these elements will take your reader from the world that is unknown to them to a world they want to discover. And it's a great world building element that has several implications and adds to the overall feel in your story. So when you include a detail like that, readers will not be surprised if something out of the ordinary happens or down the road, because they have the info that your main character is in an environment outside of the usual. World building can be as complicated or as simple as your story needs it to be, but I think that my parting advice is, when you outline the rules, stick with the outline and don't go against your own rules. Pretty much just what SD said. I think that if nowhere else, then that's where the world building rules overlap between literary fiction and the fantasy. So.
Yeah, I like the thought of the sounds, and there's one that's soothing and one that grates, and the way that you kind of differentiate between them is using that to call attention to the surroundings and stuff, because it makes it more immersive.
Mm.
And when the story can be immersive, that is when world building is done well. It's not that you have to have all of these big shiny aspects to your story, be it fiction or literary fiction, or excuse me, fantasy or literary fiction. It can be that you just immerse the reader in it, whatever, wherever they're at, you immerse them.
With a theme in mind, of course.
Right.
That's why
Yeah.
it's important
It
to
has
have
to
a
be
theme
intentional.
established. Yes, very intentional. Exactly. Your if your character has a scientific mind, obviously he's going to react to things differently. And in order to immerse your reader into it, you have to describe it from the point of view that your character has, even though it's not a first. You're not writing in first person. That doesn't matter. Um, so yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And now we talk about how to mash both of them together to create something completely new and different, which we all love.
We
And
do.
so, like, I mean, like magical realism, like, I've always kind of just sat on the fence in confusion about the differences between, to be honest. I'm like, I know that there's an aspect, but because I tend to stick more towards fantasy where it's just
Mhm.
built in,
Right.
doing something in the real world that has that magical element into it is outside of my writing comfort zone. So, Kyra,
Mhm.
explain to us, how do we blend all of that together?
So first and foremost, I want to say thank you to ST and thank you to Zara for like contributing to two genre spaces that I love. I love fantasy and I love literary fiction. I love them for different reasons, but I still would say that my favorite kinds of stories are magical realism stories, only because I think that it appeals to me as a reader and gives me access to modes of thinking that I wouldn't otherwise have access to. So magical realism is like realism or realistic fiction or however you want to put that, because you invite your readers in to a world they think they know. So you kind of draw them in by like, oh, this is so similar to what I already understand. This is so similar to how like the relationships that I have in my own life. But then when you make the intentional shift, you plant these small seeds of fantastical elements that tend to culminate in a major moment or a major shift for the character or a major shift for the scene. Then readers often go, oh, so that's why I felt the difference. I would say that magical realism gives you the opportunity to embrace realistic dynamics in and but while having access to a truth that can only be explored through the fantastical. But to build off of what Zara and Esty have said, consistency is key. And it actually might be more important in magical realism because you're making a notable shift. So you know that magical realism, a rule is being broken. Especially your reader is definitely going to think that a rule is being broken because in their mind, oh, relatively speaking, this is all realistic. But if you don't know that you're gonna make that shift from a distance, they're going to completely their suspension of disbelief is going to be completely severed, and they'll be like, what the heck, like that makes no sense, I want to throw this book out of a window. But if you know what that shift is going to be, you have to plant seeds, you have to drop hints, so that in the moment when they realize the magical or the moment they embrace the fantastical, they're like, oh my goodness, this is actually very satisfying. This is like there's a new plane or another aspect to this story. Um, so I it's interesting because magical realism sort of has a gradient. So there are some magical realism books that trend a little bit more towards the fantastical. My first book, The We and the They, at the beginning, it seems very realistic, kind of, because you're leaning into oral history, folklore. Folklore has a tendency to incorporate fantastical elements anyway, but it is articulating the experience of a true group of people, the we. But then there's a point where it comes very, very explicitly fantastical, but I drop seeds of fantastical elements leading up to the major shift, right? Otherwise, my readers would just be like, what the heck? I'm like, what is this book? Throw it away. Fortunately, that has not happened. So that's why you have to be intentional about being consistent leading up to the shift. My current book that I'm working on, because similarly to Zara and SD, we're in the thick of writing books right now, or short stories in SD's case. But my current book, Azara Blaze, is definitely more explicitly realistic, because you're like, yes, I'm in the mind of a 19-year-old girl, and a lot of the things that I would assume seem like fantastical images are contextualized within a dreamscape. And inside of dreams, everybody just sort of expects, like, oh, nothing's supposed to make sense in a dream. But then there are aspects of the dream, this isn't spoiling too much, I promise, that start to filter into the way she sees the real world. And she starts to question how much of what she's seeing is a product of her mind and how much is outside of her. And she realizes the difference between what she sees in her mind and what she experiences outside of her is contingent on whether or not it is collectively experienced. So there are some fantastical elements that are incorporated into the story that happen, and she comes to accept as reality because other people experience it with her. And other people experiencing it with her is how she undergoes her healing process. So to summarize all of that, magical realism is the perfect blend of magic and realism because it appeals to the beauty of both spaces. Magic and fantasy allows us to see ourselves beyond the confines of what we know, because there are things that are inherent and true about us that aren't solely anchored in the context we understand. There are ways that we can access and embrace dynamics when we put them farther away from ourselves and see them in new contexts. Whereas realism anchors us in our context and asks us to consider what can we do inside of our own skin to make things better, or what do we do inside of our own skin that sometimes makes things worse. So those two spaces coming together is beautiful, and it's kind of having that dynamic, but being intentional and knowing about the shift. Consistency is key. Yeah, that was kind of all over the place, but so can magical realism has a tendency to be if you aren't careful.
Yeah, no, I thought that was very on point. Like, I think that when it comes to any form of writing, it has to be consistent in the mechanics of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't just, well, I'm just gonna write a story and it's gonna be the best thing since ever. That's not how writing actually ends up happening. Like, we may want it to, but it's like, that's not how it actually works. Like, you have to be intentional. You have to build it with purpose. You have to think through consequences. And that's really like what the 4Cs are about. You have to think through the consequences of each of those things, because the creatures impact the cultures, and the culture is impacted by creation, and the conflict affects all of them. And like with literary fiction, the little things that you do all have consequences. Every decision that your character makes has something that can be pulled forward depending on what it is and what your plan for the story is, that can be either detrimental or helpful to that author, or excuse me, to the character. And with magical realism, you're blending kind of this mix of both, and you're going, okay, there's fantastical elements. They can't just be, like, they have to be put there on purpose with some form of and function in order for it to actually make sense for the reader and for them to enjoy it. They're not supposed to be thinking too much about it.
Right. Exactly.
Like, if they're spending more time trying to figure out what the heck it is you're trying to say, you've not done a good job. Like, you can confuse them in terms of like red herrings and stuff, but just to confuse them for your own demented enjoyment is not satisfying for a reader.
Right. Always remember the how and why of your shift, and you have to know that shift is coming throughout the entire story. I'm sure that's true. Frankly, if there are any kinds of shifts in any plot for any genre, you have to know about it. And 9 times out of 10, you don't want to completely blindside your reader, because then they'll be like, I do not find that compelling at all. Like, this man just gets hit by a truck, like, out of nowhere, and we're not even in a place where there are trucks. Everybody's been on, like, horses, and there's a truck now? Like, explain. Like,
It's like one of those comedic moments where it's just like, everything's fine. And then suddenly it's just like out of nowhere. It's like, why did this happen? Like,
Regina George moment, right? When she gets hit by a bus.
yeah, but at least there are buses in that world building.
Yeah.
Still weird, though. I agree.
Yeah, it was exactly.
No,
so with kind of the main points that we've covered, hopefully you guys have gotten a lot out of this, because I think that with world building, at least the authors that I've talked to, this is what intimidates them the most.
Yes.
Is world building.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really not that complicated when you boil it down to just the bare basics. But Zara has prepared some wonderful questions that we're going to kind of dive into now. So first and foremost, which world building elements are the hardest to nail and why?
Who wants to go
Zara,
first? Me?
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna nominate you first.
Okay. Which world building elements are the hardest to nail and why? This was my own question and I'm struggling to answer it. Because there are so many, you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to be honest. Okay, so I'll speak from personal experience. First of all, I think the reason that there's a reason for the saying, write what you know. Because when you write about what you don't know, like SD said, writers often do not put their try your hardest or your best pants on, and it doesn't come off very well ultimately. So for me, I want to explore the worlds in my writing, even though I write literary fiction, and I want to bring readers into and basically into a world that maybe they don't know, you know, talk about forgotten stories and forgotten cultures. That's what I like to do. So that would be the first one, to actually nail the cultures and the world building in a world that is not familiar to me. That would be the first one. And the second one is to marry that with the worldviews of the protagonists or antagonists or villains or whatever the situation ends up being, because they have their own views on that world, and I need to incorporate it so it doesn't come off as one note, right? There are elements in that world that they love or they hate, and there has to be a reason for it. So now I think that as writers we have to have an incredible capacity for empathy, because we literally have to empathize with the feelings of people that are fictional. I think that especially in today's world, it is very hard to empathize even with real people. For some reason, empathy has been to some degree removed, unfortunately. So it is even double the task to empathize with people who are fictional. So for me, those would be the two hardest world building elements to nail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Kyra, how about you?
Okay, so there are 3 that come to mind, not necessarily because I don't really know if I would go so far as to say that they're the hardest for me to nail, but they're definitely the ones that I spend the most time thinking about nailing, so I guess they're hard, because it consumes so much of how I see world building. That would be like climate, language, and beauty standards. So for my first book, The We and the They, I mean, it was all happened within the Great Famine. That really was the inciting incident that, like, you know, mobilized the we group to form anyway. So, and in my next book, New York City climate. So, like, I think that I don't know. So much can be said about the world and the stakes of things just by saying where it is and the state of resources in the place you're located. Because if you can establish that from the outset, readers already fill in the blank the kinds of dynamics that already exist, um, unless you tell them otherwise. Like Zara was saying earlier about somebody being broke in Gramercy Park, kind of thing. So climate, and then language. I think that something that I am very intentional about is, and I know that you do this in your work too, SD, is like creating like dynamic of language as markers for culture or as markers of identity claiming. So if the way somebody talks or the language somebody chooses to use means a lot about the relationship they have with the person they're speaking to.
Mm.
Like the we create their own language that they speak amongst themselves, but there's something called common tongue that everybody's expected to speak at English. So it's just sort of like, as somebody who it kind of ties into like my personal passion for language diversity, but language is a huge one that I also love to see explored in other books that I read. And then the last one, beauty standards. Like it really, when you write magical realism, you have to be very intentional about how you approach these, because when you describe different individuals and you acknowledge that people within the parameters of the culture of the world that you're building are deemed beautiful because that's so culturally determined. For example, one of the main characters in The We and the They, her name's Rose. Everybody thinks that she's gorgeous, but she is gorgeous. But I was very intentional for her to be beautiful, but not according to the Eurocentric standards that exist for beauty. You see what I mean? So I think that this is not to say that whatever that means isn't beautiful, but if beauty standards and choosing what is beautiful within the parameters of your world can be huge, do you want for certain beauty standards of the quote real world to play a role in your book, and how toxic that can be? Do you want to make a statement about that? Azara is very insecure about her appearance. She shouldn't be, but she's a 19-year-old girl. What else does she know? You know what I mean? And so that plays a role in the dynamics as well. So those would be my big three. Climate, which kind of goes to the concentric circles that SD was talking about. Climate can be that world and or national, depending on the scope of your book. The language is definitely more of a national thing. And then beauty standards can be both national and personal.
Yeah. Oh, I think all of those tend to hit on that following that kind of conflict circle, kind of working down. And that's the thing, is that it doesn't have to be necessarily global, national, personal. You just insert what makes sense for your world, but it has to revolve around conflict or cause conflict to some degree. So I was thinking about mine, and first I was like, oh, it's kind of more in line, with Zara's, cultures and stuff, which is a part of the dynamic. But when I think about like where I struggled and where I was the most meticulous was the freaking travel times in fantasy. That
just do Game of Thrones and scrap everything. Everyone teleports with a jetpack out of nowhere.
Yeah, and I don't want that. Like that can't happen. Like
apparently it can.
It can, but it shouldn't. Bad author, bad. So that was one of the things I was most meticulous about. Particularly, it came up during the revisions when I hit the second stage of revisions. because I had built this world. I had used Wonderdraft as my map maker, and they actually had the ability to track distances, which I was like, oh man, that's going to be perfect. And so because I have all of the roads and stuff planned out, and the main kind of the village is big enough to be on a map, I was like, okay, here's how it's going to be spaced out. Now, planned or coincidence or just my own stupidity, I don't know. Probably a mix of all three. Put it together equals creative genius. But almost every single village is 100 miles apart, and I'm like, why? Why did I do this to myself? This is dumb. So I mapped out the exact travel time. I had to Google how far can an average person walk in a day. Fun fact, about 10 miles on flat terrain. They were in the highlands before. So we're talking about more rocky terrain, more hills, which means it's going to slow them down because they're going up, down, around, having to cross all these kinds of things till they finally get to the main road, and then it's not so bad. But my whole thing was like, they're going to walk/run the entire way to Trineus. And I was like, oh, it's like 800 miles. There's no way that they would get there in the amount of time that I need them to get there walking, even if they were running. Like, not unless you're like fantasy CrossFit, not going to happen. So I had to be like, they got to get horses. Now I'm stuck with, how far does a horse travel in a single day? I don't know. Then I had to do all the research for the horses. Then I had to find out, how often do the horses have to stop? Because can they gallop for just like 30 miles straight without stopping? Turns out, no, they cannot. So this impacts travel time. And then I have to figure out how many days of travel they are, because I have to track everything, because everything happens within a condensed period of time. So, I mean, it was seriously so meticulous. And I'm going to have to go back during the second draft of book 2 and do the exact same freaking thing. Granted, it's more localized for the most of it. There's no running halfway across the continent like there was on the first one. But these are still things that I have to take into account. There's an army moving in the dead of winter in book 2. That slows people down. No one does that in winter. Napoleon tried it, failed. Hitler tried it, failed. My guys are going to try it. Yeah, they'll have marginal success because they're not going into freaking Russia against Russians. So, they have that going for them. But it is hard to nail down those travel time elements and to do them well. So hard, but worth it. And actually, because sometimes you end up with little Easter eggs. So when I actually did it, I was like, okay, I'm going to set the start date of the book as September 15th because we have a shared calendar. Or excuse me, September 5th, because that was the day that my baby was born. And so I was like, that's going to be the inauguration of this entire story. I worked out the exact travel time to the day. It equated out to the day that I hit publish on my book. From September 5th to December 7th is the entire time span of book 1. And December 7th is when I actually published my book. Complete accident. Not planned at all. And I was just like, that's cool. Anyway, moving on and going to go cry in a pillow now. That's fine. So, moving on to question 2. What did you find most challenging about building a world you have never been part of? Which is interesting because this kind of goes counter to the write what you know, because obviously I've never been to my world. So, So, Kyra, I'm gonna nominate you to take this challenging question on first.
Imagining how everything would taste different but the same, if that makes sense. I guess So a lot of particularly my first book was inspired by oral tradition, and particularly the oral traditions of my ancestors' survival. Thank God I don't know that world from my personal experience directly. Um, but I will say that a lot of that did influence the story, and when the hardest part was definitely trying to imagine what the pain of something would be without actually having to experience that pain, and write about a pain that you've never felt but can't imagine. And sometimes you can imagine it because in an indirect way you have experienced it. So it's kind of like write what you know but you've heard about, but you also have not been there, because there's like a sense of continuity throughout the human experience that you can relate to, but some people have more proximity to a given experience than others. So yeah, like for example, I don't want to get too sad and morbid about this, but I still have anxiety when I get on boats. Like, I don't know if that's just because of all the stories I've been told about boats. But I still have like there's like this ache in my bones. Like, why are you on a boat? There aren't dangerous things that have happened on boats. So, yeah, it's kind of like that, like feeling the ache in your bones for something that you've never actually felt, but know that somebody like you has, and that could be true for you whenever you are, because when you're writing your characters, even if they don't seem just like you, there's something about you in them. So that makes it hard, but it also makes it easier at the same time. So it's like a beautiful pain.
Yeah. Zara, how about you?
I would say the little things. I think they make all the difference. So, obviously, the Sunset in La Paz is set in Bolivia, but I don't know how, for example, Bolivians would feel if someone non-Latino appears in their city, or gringo, as they call people who are not Latino. So I actually partnered up with an anthropologist who did research there, and I hunted down one of my acquaintances, a friend of a friend. He's rather my acquaintance, who is Bolivian but left Bolivia when he was 15 to find all this little stuff, because they have traditions. They have it's called the witches market, for example, and they do all sorts of stuff that we perceive as weird, but it's their heritage, their culture, that's how they live. And I need to know that, for example, they boil frogs and sell it there. I wouldn't know that stuff unless someone who is from there lives there. So definitely this is the heart. And anytime I write a chapter, I try to add a little detail so that people get more familiar with the culture, hence the telling forgotten stories. But it's very important to me. So hopefully I'll do it justice.
Well, and that's exactly what we were talking about earlier, where is that it's important to do the research
Oh,
in
yeah.
order to do good world building, regardless of whether it's historical fiction, literary fiction. I would say even more so literary fiction than historical fiction. Granted, the historical fiction peeps, they will shred you
Mm.
if you screw up period dress and stuff like that. But because literary fiction tends to focus more on like the here and now versus some historical stuff you can kind of fudge. I think there's just that level of importance there
Oh
to
yeah. Oh yeah. You
really do
definitely.
that homework.
Oh yeah. You definitely have leeway. For example, I've been told by this Bolivian friend that they're very humble people, and they would probably welcome Alejandro in La Paz once he arrives. But I'm like, that doesn't really work for my story. So to preserve the humility which they have, I split it. There are people who welcome him, and there are people who despise him and treat him as such solely because he is American. That's it. So yeah, I try to honor it, but like I said at the beginning, you still write fiction, so you have some leeway. It just depends on where the borders are. And actually, this works better because um, it shows the spectrum of personalities that we have as people, and just because a nation is deemed as humble doesn't mean that everyone in that country is humble. So yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think having that that contrast, I mean, it's human, right? Like there's always going to be, to some degree, people who are like, "Hey," and then other people are like, "Stat." You know, it's always going to be a mix. So the most challenging part about world building, I would say, is having to flesh out the hit from a fantasy perspective, fleshing out the cultures that have really thousands of years of history in many cases. You know, I had asked my reader community, I'm like, hey, what do you guys want to know about world building, the world, you know, and then a couple listed a couple of other things, and they were like, world building or the world. I was like, yes, I haven't written that. Oh no.
Oh yeah.
So in 4 days, I literally kind of just broadly covered the first 9,000 years of world history of my world.
That
And I
is
was just like,
wild.
wow,
That is wild.
this is a lot.
Yeah. But it's what
And
people want. Totally.
yeah, they want something that is fleshed out, and I have it fleshed out enough and to where I can describe past events, but it also allows me the opportunity to create lore because I haven't detailed out everything. I get to continue building on this. This is 12 books long. Like I got to fill it up with something other than just the
Yeah.
initial stuff. Like we
Yeah.
have legends, and the fun part about legends, if you guys want like a little fantasy / sci-fi world building hack, is if you're like, I don't know what to add, but I really like this element, but it's kind of off kilter a little bit from the main part of the story, just make it a legend. You have one person tell the story, and then then later on that story gets contradicted. And they're like, that's not how that happened. This is how it happened. Because
Hashtag
isn't
pro
that
tip.
how, right? Like
That's awesome. So my favorite
Arthur,
thing.
That's awesome.
Legend of King Arthur. How many retellings and legends are there of that man? Like
A lot, and
seriously.
I hate them all.
Right. Like we know that at least to some degree, he was a historical figure who lived, but over the centuries, everyone's like, "Well, that's not how that happened. I heard he slayed like 50 guys." Next person's like, "He had a magical sword that breathed fire." And then dragons are involved, and then suddenly the Holy Grail, and then everybody it gets crazy, right? So
Yeah.
that's like next level pro tip for world building. If you want something in there that just sounds super cool, super fantastical, but you're like, it doesn't technically fit with where I'm at in the story, just make it a legend.
That
Because
is
we all have
awesome.
those. And it
Mhm.
makes your world feel bigger. Just
Yep.
big. Because it has depth. But yeah, I think that it's the world history, it's the histories of the cultures of the kingdoms and all that kind of stuff that tends to be the most challenging part for me. I can get them out, I can write the little pieces of it, but actually sitting down, if I were to like sit down in Campfire Pro and then try to write it out, I would just stare dumbly at the screen for like 30 minutes, be like, yeah, stuff happened and over a long period of time. And
No,
that's all
people
that
love
there
it.
would be.
Yeah,
Then I'd
yeah,
make
people
up
love
some
it.
random piece of information when a character asks, and then I'll be like, oh, that sounds about right. I'll just throw that into the histories.
Oh yeah. Yeah, people love it. Like, why do you think HBO is launching the House of the Dragon prequel to Game of Thrones? People are fascinated by the history, so They want to
Yep.
know what happened before the Game of Thrones. And honestly, like when I read the books, and then as I was reading the books, I was simultaneously watching the show, and I'm like, I just really don't care what's happening in the Westeros because I have a bigger picture of what's happening elsewhere in that world, and it's so much more interesting. And I was like, oh, they better launch like a prequel series where we learn about this other stuff because it's fascinating. Like honestly, yeah, George R. R. Martin is a genius, is what I'm saying, basically. I'm a huge fan.
All right. The final question here is, how do you make your characters adhere to the world building rules you created for them? So I like this because within my world, every single person that exists has been given a gift by Elohai. They can either choose to use it for him or for their own purposes. And when it's their own purposes, it falls under more of what's considered in that world magic. And so people believe that, like, hey, magic is it. That's the way to things. And then other people will follow Elohai, and it's Christian fantasy. So, I do make those distinctions known. And there are very specific rules. Magic, or just using your gift in general, comes with some sort of cost. There is a cost attributed. So you can only use it so much before it could kill you if you used it too much. It drains your energy. And one of the things that I enjoy doing is teasing impossibilities. Like, they're like, well, why can't we just transport? Like, magic is a thing. And this is the more like ignorant of the group. Just kind of very naive. And she's just like, I don't know how any of this stuff works. Like, I don't use magic. Like, I'm not a magic user. And they're like, that's impossible. Like, it would kill you. Later on, I actually use one of those impossible things in the book, and I break that rule. But there is a reason and an exception given, because when it was used, the person wasn't doing it in their power. They were doing it in the power of Elohai. It still cost them, and there is still a cost attributed that they will never be as strong as they were. But that allows me to bend the rule pretty far in this case. But that will be very, very few and far between. It will probably never happen again within the series, because nobody is as strong as this character and able to be able to facilitate something like that. So, like, when you're looking at it, you have to keep in mind that Trinia, she's one of the main characters of the book. She can perfectly duplicate herself in mind and body. The cost is that a part of her soul goes with that duplicate, thus creating a full human, a full other being. And there are certain parameters that she has to follow, and she will push the boundaries of those parameters. And those parameters have not yet been given within the context of the story. But you have to make sure that you can push right up to the edge of the world building that you have built and come back. But if you're going to break it, or if you're going to really kind of bend it, there has to be a logical, explainable reason within the book that says this is why the impossible thing was able to happen. But that is basically the only circumstance in which it could ever happen again. So you set a precedent for it. And that's kind of the main thing, is you have to set the precedent of what the expectation is kind of around across the board. Then you can kind of fudge with it a little bit. So that's kind of my 2 cents on how I work with my characters.
I think in literary fiction, it boils down to one thing, and that's consequences. So, whatever rules you establish, And decisions that come after that, you always need to ask yourself, okay, what are the consequences that my characters are going to face for that specific decision? And if you decide to break it, there has to be a very good reason for it. If you do establish that this nation of Bolivia is very, very humble, and then out of nowhere someone is terribly vain or treating your main character in an unusual way that hasn't been established, there needs to be a reason for that. They hate him because his mother did something to them, whatever it is, but you kind of need to acknowledge it and show that consequence.
I think for me, it's important to, well, it's two sides of the same coin. Remember their mortality or lack thereof, and remember their soul or lack thereof. Because that plays a huge role in the agency or lack thereof they have in the story.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, one, I love getting on here and talking about writing and talking about world building and all the other stuff that we've talked about. For anybody who is watching this back, and this may be the first video that you have seen from us. Hi. Second of all, we've done other coaching panels. So if you haven't seen the other coaching panels, I'm going to link to them up in the cards up here on the top right hand corner. We did one on how to choose a book title, and then how to write relatable characters. So if you're struggling with those things, I would highly recommend that you go up there and check those out. There will also be end screens at the end of the stream, and so you'll be able to click on those. And I highly recommend that you do. We're going to be doing one final Preptober stream on Monday. And that is going to be basically pulling together everything that we've been talking about for plotting, for outlines, how to write faster, all that. So if you haven't seen our Preptober streams, make sure you go back and you watch those. There's timestamps on them, so you'll be able to kind of poke around, as much as you want. And then coming up is actually our nano writing sprints. So we're going to be here live, and we're going to be writing with you. We're going to be doing live writing sprints, probably anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. And just we're going to try and bang out a book. I'm working on 4 short stories of about 10,000 words that I'm aiming to try and get done at the next month, which is probably the most lofty goal that I've had. Zara, you're working on the copy editing, because you submitted, correct?
No, I'm submitting October 30th, so I will be revising.
Okay, so you're revising, and then Kyra, are you also on the revising train as well?
It looks like I'll actually be writing a bit more, but
okay,
very close to revising at some point in the month of NaNoWriMo.
Gotcha. So we're all going to be writing with you guys to varying degrees, all on the struggle bus of Nano, because it's a beast.
Thing.
It's hard.
It's a thing.
So we're going to be joining and doing it with you guys. So all of those streams are scheduled and up. So I highly recommend, if you haven't already, go down and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon, so that way you guys get notified of when we go live. And also just go set a reminder. Just go to the main channel page and just click the set reminder button. That way you get notified when we do it. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be a great time. And then moving into December, we're going to be working on how do you do edits? How do you kind of self-edit your work a little bit? And we're going to be talking more about what do publishing goals look like? How do you move forward with this, this draft that you now have, or partially finished draft that you have? What does that look like? We're going to be talking about that. So it's going to be a great time. Highly recommend and invite you guys to join. And if you have any additional comments or questions about world building, make sure to drop them down in the comments. We will be sure to answer you. So everybody, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. Take care.